Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of Marini Furniture. In this episode, I will take you from this slab to a set of 3 cutting boards and walk you through every step in between, including selection, milling, planing, design, squaring, filling, CNC, fine touches, finishing, and presentation. If you happen to find the chaos favorable, please drill the like button, comment, and subscribe. But most of all, enjoy the show. Okay, let's get to it. So a lot of my lumber I have built up over the course of years. Some going back as far as 5 years now, which has afforded me the time to air dry the wood, which is not a woodworker's preference, but some of us have to make do. One of the greatest shortfalls of my shop is the lack of space and thus a kiln. However, excuses are like you know what's, so I have been drafting plans for a solar kiln to accelerate the drying process and improve the moisture consistency throughout my slabs. Additionally, I'm going to be conducting an experiment in an upcoming episode that may resolve the issue for those without a kiln, so stand by for that. What I'm doing here is essentially drafting a design based on the dimensions of the material. I knew I wanted to create a really nice larger cutting board. However, I also explored the possibility of a set of cutting boards, which, as you can see, I begin to conceptualize. I didn't want to get too attached to the idea of a set because we all know how plans go. Everyone has one until they get punched in the face. So I precautionarily set my expectations up front. In my even more novice milling days, I would chainsaw these logs like somebody who would likely be mistaken for a crazed lunatic. I did not have the proper milling kit to adapt the saw into a chainsaw mill and would often mill my logs vertically and thus unevenly without any sense of precision. That is the story of this slab, and now I am reaping the benefits of those inadequacies. So because I am attempting to harvest an additional slab out of this, I need to be very accurate with the mill. The best way for me to do this is to plane a relatively even surface to create a solid foundation for the rails of the mill. This will allow me to harvest as much workable material as possible and get me one step closer to achieving the miracle. Everything going to plan. Now look at that. This moment is like a gender reveal party for woodworkers as the slab exposes all of its brilliant potential. I couldn't have been more excited about the personality of these slabs. I consider a solid milling execution as the precursor to squaring off my project. Believe it or not, I generally like to square off my projects with the largest surface of which I plane. With the limitations of my shop, I found my planing process to be most accurate and efficient, which sets the stage for all other squaring cuts. I have said it before, I will say it again, and I will continue to say it. Dry run your router sled. I always invest the extra time to ensure that I am not pushing the router bit too hard. Slide the router all the way up and all the way down to ensure the bit does not make contact with the sled. And also check your clamping system to ensure that the bit will not come into contact with your clamps. So the way I arrange these slabs on the router sled is milled side down. I know that side is the most flat, and in fact it was flat enough that I did not have to level the corners to ensure I am planing an even surface. Because I felt like the bit was going to have to remove too much material, I used the powered hand planer to remove some excess. As you will see in this video, the clamps were getting too close for comfort, and I transitioned to a full set of dowels to support the slab through the planing process. This way, if the bit comes into contact with the dowels, it will simply remove a portion of the dowel as opposed to an event much more unsafe. After a few rounds of removing no more than 3/16 of an inch at a time, we have achieved a clean cut, even surface on both slabs, and double check the precision of that surface with a level, because although your work might look good, the level never lies. Lo and behold, the slab survived to the design phase. At this point, I carefully observed that the workable material will suffice with the design of a larger cutting board, which, as you begin to see, I mark the outline for. I then begin to chalk out the perimeter while scouting out the dimensions of the medium and small cutting boards. As I am doing that, I come to the conclusion that the amount of workable material for the small cutting board would have to be redesignated as more of a cheese board, meaning that I didn't feel like it was worth risking limiting any additional surface area for a juice groove, and that we would have to leave it as it is. One of the greatest furniture makers of all time, George Nakashima, once said, "Each tree not only has its different size and shape, but color and character, and each board from each tree has a distinctly different personality," which couldn't be put any better. And when it comes to design, you're attempting to capture every bit of that personality within your work. I've found that there are two things that are extremely important when it comes to making cutting boards. One is moisture content level, and two is squaring. We've already touched on moisture content level, so we will begin with squaring. As I stated earlier, I personally like to start with ensuring that my largest surface is planed perfectly flat. That is my anchor point for a sequential set of cuts to ensure that I'm maintaining 90 degrees on every edge. As you can see, I start with a circular saw, which is good for a rough cut. I then migrate over to the joiner. Running that rough cut through the joiner, supported by my perfectly planed large surface, ensures that I'm making this first angle on the boards exactly 90 degrees. This joiner is another great tool I've had for well over a decade. Some great things come in small packages, and until I upgrade to a full-size shop, this piece of machinery is incredible at the hobbyist level. I personally like to run it at full speed and remove no more than 1/16 to 1/32 at a time. I feel like it doesn't stress the machine too much, and I get a nice clean cut. So now that we have our most critical square established, we pivot off that angle to ensure we maintain those 90-degree angles all the way around the board. We begin with using the circular saw to square off the shorter sides of each board, which typically I would recommend a chop or miter saw if it is large enough to make the cut, as my circular saw, even with an edge to guide it, can still wander. Something I wanted to add to each of my episodes is a knowledge question, simply to make things a bit more interesting. I absolutely love expanding my knowledge and skill when it comes to woodworking, and one of the ways I like to do this is to thumb through my library of woodworking and wood books to push my limits. So we will begin the question of the episode series. What is the hardest wood in the world? The clue is an additional question. Why did they name it that? As there is a very specific reason that they named it that. Now, the answer to the question is a bit debated if you dig into online research, but it is still nonetheless very interesting. So if you know the answer or decide to research it and find the answer, type that into the comments and I will respond. As we close in on completing the squaring segment of the project, we run the alternate long side of each board through the joiner a few more times to ensure we have a nice even surface. As you will see in the CNC segment, squaring is so important when it comes to CNCing the juice grooves. If the board is not perfectly square, the juice groove appears to be crooked and will make the entire cutting board look unprofessional. On to filling. In my last episode, I briefly walked through how I really enjoy making my own glue from scratch, but like I said, I'm still exploring mastery of water resistance and waterproofing of that project. With cutting boards enduring so much usage and requiring washing after use, I felt it best to bench the homemade glue this episode and continue my research. Filling usually requires 2 to 3 phases, if not more. The reason is the fillers settle or lose moisture and kind of shrink, so to speak. So you'll apply your filler and come back sometime later to find that the gap is less of a gap, but still requires additional filler. So the iterations of filling, sanding, vacuuming ensue. As you can see from that first clip there, if you do forget to vacuum after sanding, the thin layer of sanding residue creates a layer between the wood and the filler and prevents it from making contact with the wood and kind of clumps up a bit. It becomes a mess. So do not forget to vacuum between iterations. When it comes to CNC, one of the things I like to do first is inspect and clean my CNC machine. Much like a batter digging in before the pitch, this machine requires absolute attentiveness as much can go wrong. So I like to make sure all the screws and nuts are in place. I will check the cables in the rear, as I have caught one of these getting yanked out of place, which absolutely destroyed a project because the Z-axis ran wild. Once I am dug in and feel comfortable that the machine is ready for operation, I measure for exact dimensions of the cutting board so that I can accurately design and program the juice groove in my software. Here in the software, I input the dimensions on the board, offset the perimeter to the interior by about 1/2 inch, select my bit, set the speed and depth of the bit, and save the G-code file for the execution software. Again, I dig in before the pitch, which is execution. I am double checking everything. I make sure that the bit has been properly tightened and perform a dry run before running the machine at minimal depth. I've found with first time projects, it is best to progress to the end result of your CNC vision with rounds, each round cutting deeper than the first because a lot can go wrong. My shop has limited power, so I'm not able to run a vacuuming system simultaneously with other tools, so unfortunately it requires quite a bit of cleanup. The surface of the CNC is not hard to clean, but the rails of the X-axis require special attention as most of the dust collects there and it starts to cake. It's not a huge deal until you start to CNC fine figures into your work and you begin to notice that the design is not what you were expecting. I have made a lot of cutting boards, and one of the touches I have added over time is rounding the edges of the boards with a 1/8 inch rounding bit. You can sand the edges of your boards instead, but you have to be selective with your grit and ensure that you are sanding evenly, otherwise the edges come out inconsistent and the board does not look clean. This bit alleviates that issue, and I follow up with 400 grit to deliver a nice smooth edge. My method of finishing requires multiple phases. The reason being I use pure tung oil. This oil is undeniably my favorite finish, ironically because it's such a challenge. Over the years, I have experimented relentlessly to get the desired result. Now, phase one is a two-parter. I like to apply the tung oil pretty thick in this phase and let it settle overnight. This way the oil seeps deep into the wood for as long as it needs. The second part of phase one begins with wiping off any excess and then reapplying evenly over the surface in a much thinner layer. I leave it outside for a significant amount of time in the shade and out of direct sunlight. Then I repeat for phase three: sand, vacuum, tung. This allows me to build a perfectly flat foundation to set the stage for a very thin, consistent final layer. I continue to explore the mastery of pure tung oil, and I'm still determining that perfect grit of sandpaper between applications where I remove the tung above the surface without agitating the tung at the surface. Historically, I've used 2000 grit, but I am compelled to find a sequence of sanding grits that perform even better. So we'll keep you all updated in future episodes. I'm going to briefly touch on the soul of woodworking. One of my deepest passions in life is woodworking, and as I dust off years of intermittent absence due to public service, I simply wanted to share the passion with you all, as well as the journey back, and plan to roll out an episode every month. Woodworking is one of the most incredible art forms in the world to me. One of the most incredible traits about woodworking is that there is nearly endless degrees of skill subsets. You have arborists, millers, kiln technicians, slab specialists, furniture makers, hand tool purists, carvers, nailless carpenters, joinery masters, and the list goes on. Woodworking is for everyone and anyone, whether you are limited to your studio or apartment with hand tools or have the wealth to establish a full-size shop. Whatever walk of life you are in and whatever you are going through in life, it is never too late to start, and you just might find that simple joinery between men and wood is exactly what you were looking for. As we approach the end of finishing phase 2, we set the boards outside and out of direct sunlight on another nice sunny day with no wind. Rolling into finishing phase 3, we repeat the steps one last time: sand, vacuum, tung. As we sand, we are really performing our final pre-inspection, as this is the last round of finishing and we want to make sure all abnormalities and bumps are smoothed out so that we can ensure that the surface is as even as possible. I again apply a very minimal amount of oil, maybe about the size of 2/4 worth on the large board. When you apply too much tung oil, particularly on the final phase, it can kind of gum up a bit and you'll end up with a less than glossy and less than smooth surface. You want to make sure you spread it out entirely and cautiously. Closing in on completion, we go ahead and wipe the surface down with a clean and moist towel and give the boards one last round of fine sanding with, believe it or not, 10,000 grit. I absolutely love this grit because it smooths over any micro bumps on the surface without penetrating the final layer. This way you still maintain the desired degree of gloss without scuffing the surface. You all have made it to the presentation segment. I like to shoot my photos with my old Nikon D610 and will likely transition the conclusion of my episodes to using this camera as the shots come out more than incredible. The character of the slabs is absolutely captured in these final shots of the cutting board set, which was the goal from the beginning. This slab could not have had more to offer, and I was extremely pleased with the outcome of this project. I hope you all have enjoyed the show. If you did, please like, comment, and subscribe to be notified of my next episode, of which I will likely publish in the next few weeks to a month. If you cannot wait that long, you can entertain yourselves with my first 2 episodes. Most importantly, thank you for watching, master your craft, and until next time.